Chapter 16. We Lose Murchie. That night, in the rebels' tent, Don casually asked Popa, "Ever drunk any Wog cognac?" "Only once," answered Popa reminiscently, "during the last stoush in these parts in 18. I only drank a bottle or two. I woke up screaming. Little blue mice were gnawing me to death. A large pink elephant saved me in the nick of time. He came rushing up, trumpeting fire like Flammenwerfer, and trampled the mice to death. Leave to Jerusalem was granted the battalion. Pleasurable was the excitement when the rebels' turn came, with Sergeant Popa in charge. Very excited was the Wog dog, all done up in his new corporal's uniform. The rebels in a body boarded the leave bus. Horrie the first aboard. These leave buses each held 30 men. The drivers were Arabs and wilder men. At the wheel you wouldn't find anywhere in the world. They'd simply turn on the juice, trust the lives of all to Allah, and let her go. They'd grin from ear to ear as the bus roared along with the boys yelling, "Let her go, George, let her go." They needed no encouragement. Those drivers made the hair rise on my head for a mistake of inches along portions of the hilly road meant the bus must go hurtling far below. There was barely room for two buses to crawl past one another. The judgment of the drivers was miraculous in truth. Again and again the good Allah did look after us. A toot behind was never the signal to the driver that another bus wished to pass. It was the signal for a race, and a race it was, with the driver's grin set and his eyes sticking out like pickled onions as we took hairbreadth bends on two wheels with the rival bus roaring up beside us, filled with cheering, carefree soldiers. Head and head, the boys would yell as the buses drew level. "Beat him on the post, George." "Shave his wheel, George." "Topple him in the ditch, George." It was impossible not to laugh and thrill even though the opposing bus was wearing us down with little more than a coat of paint separating the vehicles. I'd breathe a sigh of relief at sight of the walls of Jerusalem far below. Our first job in Jerusalem was to buy Corporal Horry's identity disc. We filled into a cubicle, the metal worker squatting there tinkering at his trade as his forefathers had done for centuries. We handed him a Greek 2-drachma coin, a souvenir from Greece for the purpose. The master craftsman bent over his work, and with the tools of 1,000 years ago neatly inscribed on the coin, Horry's name, number, and unit. Horrie EX1 2/1 M/GBN. The EX1 was a special. It meant that Horrie was number 1, warrior from Egypt. The coin, his historic identity disc, with the unit color patch were attached to the harness, which he so proudly wore. "There's never been a soldier dog so well dressed up as he," said Sergeant Popa admiringly, and the Wog dog proudly wagged his stump. "Better keep a tight grip on him," advised the Gog. We did. There was a fanatical light in Horry's eye. Around us was the shuffling of thousands of his enemies, surly-visaged Arabs and folk of every Eastern nation. The sight of the little wog dog leading, almost pulling us through the streets of Jerusalem, created an interest not unmixed with laughter at Horrie's menacing growls. From a crowd of noisy guides, we selected a laughing little chap who declared he was the son of Sandy Mackenzie. He took us first to the Wailing Wall, built by King Solomon in 1000 BC. It is one of the holiest of Jewish shrines. Shrouded figures even now seemed to be clutching the base of the age-old wall. At night, these old rocks are moist with the dew said to be shed by the rocks from weeping, in unison with the Jews. A legend says that long ago the old wall had been lost to sight by time, and the refuse tumbled upon it during the numerous battles, in which the old city was finally put to the sword. In time a shrewd king wished the wall uncovered, and to save labor threw handfuls of coins upon the earth, then buried it. The Jews of Jerusalem uncovered the wall by scraping the earth away while seeking the coins. Judging by the prices charged the Australian soldiers for articles they bought in Jerusalem, there is truth in this legend. Sandy Mackenzie next guided us to the Bazaar, showing us the old city first. We were indeed away back thousands of years ago. The Bazaar was like the warrens of an underground city. The narrow streets were roofed after the style of an arcade, into which light filtered through narrow slits in the roof. Under this medieval arrangement, the light filtered down through drifting dust and smoke. Through the gloom came the shuffling of many feet as mysterious figures glided past. From the windows of tiny jewelers' shops, dim lamps reflected gleams of light from jewels. Here and there, exposed to the open street, was a butcher's shop, with meat swarming with flies. Fruit and vegetable stalls extended across the footpaths, and even on the roads along which many little donkeys slowly came, bowed down under giant burdens. On top of these great loads solemnly squatted the owner, lord and master. Struggling on foot behind would come the wife, and loaded with goods, while behind her would trudge the children according to age, also heavily loaded. This use of women and children as beasts of burden used to make the troops very angry in Egypt and Palestine. From many gloomy shops in the walls, dim figures bent over brass and bronze, copper and gold, and silver work, squatted and smoked and waited and toiled and gossiped, as their forefathers had done for thousands of years, throughout wars and pestilence and famine, throughout plenty and desperation, throughout the uttermost heights of glory to the most terrible depths of despair, has Jerusalem survived for thousands of historic years. Black-clad Arab women peered at us over cloaks drawn up just below flashing black eyes. A hooded head-dress covered the head to the forehead. Silver and copper coins hung from the forehead, over the nose. Everywhere was the murmur of guttural, hoarse, soft, or whispering voices, haggling over prices of wares. I wonder what those little flags mean, knotted fits to small flags, drooping dejectedly over gloomy dwelling holes. Sandy Mackenzie explained. A white flag advertised that therein hopefully waited a marriageable daughter. A blue flag meant that an unmarried mother with child waited within, ready for a personable husband who wished a family ready-made. A black flag meant a widow for whose marriage a father was willing to pay a dowry. A green flag meant that the occupant was absent on a holy pilgrimage to Mecca. We wandered for long, intensely interesting hours in the old city. Here we lived again in the East, unchanged, since the days of Christ. What a contrast to pass from the old city to the new, to walk from 2,000 years ago straight into today. The new city was a place of modern buildings and clean, wide concrete roads, along which taxis smoothly hurried. The traffic was directed by tall Englishmen, clothed in the blue uniform and white helmet of the Palestine police. There were modern picture theaters, and here on the screen was flashed in English, French, Arabic, and Hebrew the interpretation of the play. Wide concrete footpaths reflected light so glaringly that 90% of the people wore sunglasses. The modern shops displayed glittering jewelry and vivid, gorgeous silks. The sober dark gowns of priests of many religions mingled with the bright flimsy frocks and the sporty gay-colored shorts and closely fitting sweaters of Miss Jerusalem. Large open cafes had their marble and glass-topped tables and chairs extending onto the footpaths, protected from the sun by gaily colored veranda blinds, reminiscent of Paris. The men wore gray slacks and light, open-necked silk shirts. This was a modern city of carefree atmosphere. One night, soon after our arrival in Palestine, we were awakened by Horrie's frantic bark. Something in that bark brought nightmare memories of Greece and Crete, and instinctively we were flying for the slit trenches. The bombs whined down and exploded, but nobody was hurt. It was only a lone night raider, but all the same Horrie was on the alert. At daylight, Horrie quietly slipped out to inspect the bomb craters. He found an Arab there who was also curious. Horrie immediately attacked and returned growling to the tent, with his mouth full of Arab pants. Meanwhile, energetic training went on apace amongst a great many congregating army throughout the length of Palestine. Our crowd, though, felt very uneasy, for there were increasing rumors of a new campaign about to break out in Syria, and those many thousands of us who had lost our arms in Greece and Crete were not yet re-equipped. "What are the chances?" growled Murchie. "Live in hopes," answered Sergeant Popa. "You can bet your life the heads are doing all in their power to re-equip us." But the old war horse was plainly anxious, as were thousands of other men throughout Palestine. We did not want to be left out of any stunt. We were only just beginning to realize fully the disasters that had overtaken our forces in Greece and Crete, the fateful losses in men, ships, and material, the miraculous fight the small navy had put up, a navy we now knew was fearfully battered in ceaseless fights against overwhelming odds. We realized the desperate struggle now being waged to keep us supplied with bare necessities, let alone the difficulties of manufacture and transport from Britain of great quantities of new material. But an event occurred in the life of the rebels that overshadowed the anxieties of war. Horrie disappeared. The search started in earnest. The whole battalion, or those men off duty, searched the camps for miles around, armed with his photograph. Many a false clue was followed up, to no avail. We were in despair. On the 9th day, a leave party left for Tel Aviv, 40 miles away. Don Gil was with them. They were walking down a street in Tel Aviv when an excited bark halted them. There was the Wog Dog, streaking across the street, dodging the dangerously moving traffic. He leaped at Don, tried to eat him. He was in a shocking state, skinny as a rake, covered in oil and tar. The boys took him to a restaurant and fed him on the chicken and the sandwiches. They ate the bread themselves. We never learned how Horrie had traveled that 40 miles to Tel Aviv. He may have been commandeered by some foul renegade. Being a rebel dog, he more probably went AWL, simply jumped on a leave bus and took a trip to town. Tel Aviv is a modern city, although 30 years ago it was but desolate sand dunes. The Jewish inhabitants of Jaffa built the city from money supplied by the Jewish National Fund. The Jews mostly moved to Tel Aviv, leaving ancient Jaffa to the Arabs. In our wanderings, we strolled over many of the last war battlefields of Palestine. One of these was Gaza, city of Samson. Numbers of the stone houses still bore signs of our shelling, while on the slopes of Ali Montar we could still find souvenirs of the terrible fighting that took place on that grim Turkish redoubt. Throughout both Syria and Palestine, as we traveled by train and truck, we used to wonder again and again how the Anzacs successfully fought for hundreds of brazen miles through this country. They had only horses for transport. We had trucks and tanks and trains and aeroplanes. Their only water in the Sinai Desert was in the far scattered oases, while we had reservoirs and a pipeline beside us. We often wondered how they did it and pushed a fighting enemy back ahead of them. But near tragedy was looming over the rebels after all this time of close comradeship. Action was soon to break out across Syria, and the rebels would not be in it. Many of the troops were not yet re-equipped. We had to remain in Palestine. Murchie had become more and more restless. Popa more and more gloomy. Sergeant Popa had an idea that no war could be properly won unless the rebels were in the vanguard. The 2/3 M/G battalion looks like being in it, said Murchie. What about applying for a transfer to their unit and seeing the fun? Easier said than done, answered Popa. There are enough boys applying for transfer to stock a new army. How about Horry? I asked. He may not be accepted as part of their show like he is here. We couldn't go anywhere without him now, smiled Don. Horry sat on my bed with his ear cocked, listening intently. The little fellow understands every word we say, said Popa as he patted the Wog Dog. Horry's expression certainly meant, don't leave me behind, please. We talked until long into the night, weighing the pros and cons. But in the long run, it was only Murchie who succeeded in gaining a transfer. After the show in Syria is over, I'll rejoin you blokes quick and lively, he promised cheerfully. We knew he would if possible, and we were glad to see him his old cheerful self again. Murchie was born for action, but we were awfully sorry to lose him, and he tried to hide his sorrow at leaving us, even temporarily. His last words were, "Good luck, you chaps, and good luck, little wog dog." Horrie knew he was losing a staunch friend. He stood on his hind legs and rested his paws on Murchie's knee as Murchie knelt to pat him. Long after he was out of sight, Horrie sat outside the tent, gazing in the direction Murchie had taken. We never saw Murchie again. In the far-flung movements of a world war, units once separated do not always rejoin. Murchie is in Java now. We picture him as still holding out in the hills with some wild band of guerrillas, fighting jungle ambushes as he fought with his battered truckload of New Zealanders and Greeks during that desperate retreat from Greece. Somehow we feel confident that we will see Murchie again after it is all over. The rebels will stage their grand reunion. Chapter 17. Horrie falls in love. After the Syrian campaign, our unit was moved to a camp in Kassa, and here was born Horrie's great romance. We camped alongside the 2/1 anti-tank regiment, just returned from the campaign. I strolled across to locate Bruce McEllery, Horrie trotting beside me. When someone yelled, "Imshi," I took no notice, as this was the command to some stray Arab to clear out. Get to hell out of it. Imshi yelled that abusive voice, as if at me. "What's biting you?" I called to the soldier. "It's okay, Dig," he laughed. "Don't get your wool off." "What's the matter?" I asked as Horrie and I strolled across to him. "I thought that was our little dog Imshi," he replied. "He's the dead spit of her, with reservations." I knew there was a lady dog of his breed in Crete. I said, "Surely there's not another in Palestine." "Wait till you see her," he replied. "You wouldn't know them apart, except that she's got a longer tail. She's our mascot, been with us through Egypt, Greece, and Syria." "Horrie's been with us in Egypt, Greece, and Crete," I replied. "Been sunk on a transport too." "That evens up the record," he laughed. "Horrie's got a wound stripe," I added. "That goes one better," he said glumly, "although I'll bet your Horrie hasn't wet his pants as often as our Imshi has." "Horrie's been in plenty of ticklish engagements," I replied, "and if he couldn't find a tree, he used my boot." I located Mac, and we enjoyed a great yarn. Noticing that Horrie had disappeared, I asked, "What's this Imshi of yours?" "The gamest little dog in the world," he laughed. "Hardly the size of a woolly elephant, but with guts of a lion." "Why, I've heard about her. The whole army has," he said proudly. "You'll see her later. Her valet is the cook, and he puts more science into preparing a meal for her than he does for the troops. She probably appreciates his efforts more, I laughed. Oh, he's not a bad cook, said Mac, and then Horrie appeared with Imshi, with the most innocent expression, tongue gently hanging out, one ear at the cock, one at the flop. He trotted up to introduce Imshi to me. She was following behind. "'Struth," declared Mac. "He's pirated her. Most obviously so." Oh, the he-male of the species. No longer was he a seasick hero playing second fiddle to Ben the sea-dog. Here he was Horrie the wog-dog, on solid ground, with the bashful Imshi following behind. I stooped down and smiled, and patted Imshi. She responded bashfully. A come-hither look in her large brown eyes. I laughed, having been caught before. Horrie fussed about her, his every attitude informing her I was quite all right, just one of the boys. "I dunno," said Mac thoughtfully, "but this love at first sight may cause trouble. We are in the land of Antony and Cleopatra," I said. "They both passed this way." "Yes," replied Mac, "and what was the end of the journey?" But Horrie, fussing round and round Imshi, had no misgivings. As to the winsome Imshi, she cared not a rap. Imshi, though trustfully timid, was game too. She was of the same breed as Horrie, and an attractive wench indeed to a wog dog, even though a shade taller, and of the same coloring and build, with her proudly carried tail obviously longer. Having captured me, she turned all her wiles on Horrie, showing off her paces while pretending she took far more interest in me than in him. "She's bent on conquest," said Mac resignedly. "He's a goner." "It always works out that way," I answered, "when the lady has made up her mind." Imshi now blatantly set herself to capture the wog-dog's heart. Having further won my admiration, she pretended not to notice the admiring Horrie, but pranced away around us, with head playfully erect, fox-trotted back to us, and then, with a sparkle in her eye, bounded away behind a tent. Ah, but if Horrie did not trot after her, she would immediately reappear. When Horrie was not chasing this provocative miss, he sat at my feet, voicelessly admiring her. "Go your hardest, Horrie," I advised. "She is only kidding you," and Horrie would trot after her, catch her up, and sit beside her while both intently gazed at the horizon. "Just a bit of finesse," grinned Mac. Horrie, anxious at getting nowhere, sniffed inquiringly at her face. She disdainfully turned her cheek. Mac chuckled. Horrie playfully took hold of her ear, but Imshi scornfully turned her head aside. Horrie playfully tugged at her ear, but she snapped at him, and he bashfully shuffled back to squat and view her inquiringly, little head to one side. No ordinary street pickup, this lass. I grinned at Mac. He grinned back with a wink. "I bet she lands him," he said confidently. She did. Horrie, puzzled by Imshi's attitude, trotted back to me with a comical look of inquiry. Imshi gave a sudden yelp, and raced after some mystical object in the distance. Horrie wheeled around and excitedly raced after her. "He's a goner," said Mac, with finality. The two little white figures gradually disappeared across the sandy waste. "That's done it," said Mac in triumph. I returned to camp. Very late that night I felt Horrie quietly climbing up to the foot of my bunk. "Imshi's a nice little dog," I said, and felt his stub tail wagging in agreement. The two became inseparable. If Horrie was missing, I'd find him with Imshi away across at the anti-tank regiment. If Imshi was missing from her rightful camp, she'd be playing with Horrie at our camp. It was sweet romance. But the practical Horrie combined belly love with it. He invited Imshi to come across and share his bone. She accepted somewhat disdainfully. Then she invited him across to her camp to taste real meat. Horrie accepted with an alacrity that hinted of planned purpose beforehand. "He's a little strategist," laughed Popa. "He angled for that. He knows Imshi's cook boss can give him much more tasty meat than we can." "And plenty of it," added Gordy. "Horrie will be a regular visitor at the anti-tank cookhouse." And he was. As the days passed, Horrie found himself torn between his desire to accompany us on our route marches and his longing to dally with Imshi. He tried his hardest to coax Imshi to accompany us, but she was adamant. Active service experience had evidently taught her that camp was the safest place, and she was determined to stick to it. Away we would march, with Horrie gazing longingly at the column, and then running back to Imshi in a last effort to persuade her to come along. He would coax all he knew until we were a long way off. Then, with a resigned, "Well, we'll be seeing you tonight," he would come scampering after us as fast as his funny little legs could carry him. At the head of the column, he would take his place beside Big Jim and gaze up with little tongue hanging out and trusting brown eyes full of wisdom as he waddled his quaint little body into step. "So, you've decided to join the parade." Big Jim would growl down at the tiny dog, and Horrie would gaze up with a wag of his tail and knowing wink that plainly said, "After all, soldiering must come before pleasure." Then he'd look back at the grinning rebels, his tiny feet and comical waddling body keeping time to the tramp, 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 tramp. "You're a dinkum rebel, all right," Big Jim would scold. "Shun, eyes front," and the wog dog would pay attention to the job ahead. But we had to put our foot down on Horrie's midnight romances, on the score of pressing military necessity, to enjoy a full issue of sleep, and at the same time save our rifles from Arab thieves. We now found it necessary to chain Horrie up every evening. Otherwise, the night would call, and he would throw duty to the winds and vanish to the desert with Imshi. Antony and Cleopatra caught the moon madness upon these very sands. Our hearts were all with the little wog dog and Imshi, but we had to safeguard those rifles. Imshi, once assured it was now impossible for Horrie to escape at night, very sensibly remained in her comfortable quarters near the cook in the anti-tank regiment. But first thing in the morning she would call for him, we would let him loose, and away she would take him to her friend, the cook, for breakfast. When they could eat no more, away they would trot on a lizard-hunting expedition for the day. At least, I hope so. Time drifted on, with all troops engaged in strenuous training. Then, into the idyll of the Wog Dog came the big bad wolf, a huge, gaunt, savage Alsatian. He came prowling into the lines of the Light Aid Detachment, a famished outcast. No man would turn a homeless, hungry dog away, at least not until he had given him a feed, and the Alsatian was so good of a meal that he simply refused to leave. So the LAD adopted him. He immediately repaid it by becoming an excellent watchdog. No prowler dare enter the LAD lines even on the darkest night. He would have been torn to pieces. As this was the Casa area, the LAD named their huge wolf dog Casa. The name fitted him to a T. His giant, gaunt frame, his snarling teeth, the glare in his eye all fitted in to Casa the Goliath. Worthily he guarded the camp of his benefactors, the LAD. However, those insignificant insects, the watchdogs Horrie and Imshi, were in opposite camps. Hence they and Casa were enemies in Dogland, and the cheeky Horrie made no bones about his dislike for the new arrival. "I hope that little wretch doesn't buy a fight with Casa," remarked Fitz one day. "If he does, there'll only be one mouthful in it," said the Gog grimly, "and that mouthful will be Horrie." I was very uneasy, as were all the rebels, for the little Wog Dog's safety. He had long since grown the idea that he was an army of his own. If Casa should take a fancy to Imshi, laughed the irrepressible Feathers, "there'll be skin and hair flying." Even as we were talking, Casa on giant legs came boldly towards our tent. Horrie leapt up with hackles erect, growling menacingly. In no uncertain manner he warned Casa, "Keep clear of the tent." Casa stood and glared down at him. "He's wondering whether the Wog Dog is worth just one bite," said Popa. "Don't do anything. Perhaps they may be content with an armed neutrality." But they were determined on fight and war, was declared a week later. It came about through a lady. Imshi was trotting across to visit Horrie when she was waylaid by Casa. Horrie was dozing when Imshi's yelp for help urged him out of the tent. He saw his girlfriend in distress and charged straight at Casa, who wheeled from the cowering Imshi to face the insignificant hero. The big dog stumbled, and Horrie gripped his hind paw and used war service and tactics to escape annihilation. As the big dog yelped and snarled, Horrie hung on, dragging the leg round. The long body followed, round and round, the Alsatian's fangs striving to reach the tiny tormentor. Horrie clung on like a vicious rat to a lion's hind paw. Try as Casa would, his snapping fangs could not reach him. Imshi had backed away to watch the gallant Horrie, but now she flew to the rescue and sank her teeth in the neck of the big dog. As his neck straightened out in fury, she darted away. The instant his head snapped back towards Horrie, that instant she flew back at his neck. It was perfect teamwork, and in the first swift scurry of attack the Goliath was mercilessly outwitted. But in a matter of moments the powerful Casa would turn the tables, and here Frank Bruce came running to the rescue with shouts and blows, trying to break the mix-up. Frank separated them, but received a nasty gash in the arm from the infuriated Casa. The big dog limped away snarling, with Horrie standing protectingly in front of Imshi, growling to Casa to keep moving. When the danger had faded away, Horrie received a pat from Frank in recognition of his bravery. Then, with his tail mast high and hackles erect, he proudly escorted Imshi back to the anti-tank lines. Poor Frank, nursing a very painful arm, made his way across to the RAP to get the wound stitched. But life is a whirligig of hopes and sorrows, of joys and setbacks, and even lovers must part. The anti-tank regiment was ordered to Syria, and Imshi marched with it. A woebegone lover, Horrie haunted the abandoned campsite. As the days passed, and she did not return, he even refused his tucker, and grew thin, scrawny, and miserable. Then he took to roaming the countryside, visiting the scattered camps, and searching for his lost love. "We'll have to do something with that young Romeo," declared Popa, "or he'll fade away into the desert dust." "What did you do under similar circumstances?" grinned Feathers. "Took it like a man," declared Popa. "A fine mess it's made of you," remarked the Gog. "I could point out some men," answered Popa impressively, "and mind you, I needn't go past the rebels, who are such a mess that even years of soldiering will never make anything out of them." "How many years of soldiering have you had, Popa?" asked Fitz innocently. "But Horrie disappeared. We searched for him far and wide." "Women always mean trouble," sighed Popa wearily, after a long, exhausting search. "If he's followed the anti-tank regiment, he's got a long way to go," said Feathers. "I wish the little beggar would turn up," sighed Dawn. "He did, on the evening of the 5th day. Some of the boys, returning from leave, had picked him up on the road to Jerusalem, 50 miles away. Horrie was in a pitiable state, skinny as a rake, footsore and weary. He tried to kiss each of us at once. He ate like a wolf and lay about and rested a few days. Soon he was on the way to becoming his old self again." "How soon they forget love," sighed Popa. "You're forgotten long ago," grinned Fitz. "That's something anyway," answered Popa dreamily. "So far as you nitwits are concerned, I don't think you've even been remembered." But Horrie had by no means forgotten Imshi. Whenever her name was mentioned, he would jump up with brightening eyes, tremblingly excited. Chapter 18. The Hazards of Peace. During November, big news excited us. We soon would move to Syria. From returning troops we heard tales of icy cold. Horrie is a desert dog, despite his Greek campaign, said Feathers. How will he stand up against bitter winds and snow and sleet? "Make him a uniform," ordered Popa, "for service in Arctic regions." Dawn offered an old great coat he had scrounged from a salvage dump. We cut off the tail, stood Horrie on my bunk, and draped the piece of coat over him. He appeared dubious, but guessed something new was in the wind. As I snipped off the material at his stern end, the Gog advised, "Be careful of his rudder." Horrie instinctively sat on his tail, so protecting that appendage from the scissors. As we got time off duty and the uniform began to take shape, we grew quite keen, as did the patient Horrie. We fitted the head and body and legs really neatly, allowing for a row of buttons down the belly. But then came a problem. "How about his fly?" inquired Fitz. "He can't undo buttons, but he must have a fly." "Could we make it like the sailor's trousers?" asked Feathers, doubtfully. "Sailors appear to manage without buttons. I don't know how they do it myself." "How about Scots style lilts?" grinned Gog. "Nitwit," snapped Popa. "Scotsmen wear pants." "How do you know?" inquired the Gog. "Anyway, the Wog Dog must wear pants," said Don. "Otherwise he will freeze." "I don't know what we are going to do about the tail, either," said Gordy. "It's only a stub of a thing, and all gristle, but he uses it quite a lot." "He uses everything quite a lot," said Fitz. "To wrap his tail up might spoil his carriage," insisted Gordy. "I don't know about the carriage," grinned Fitz, "but it would spoil his wagon." "Funny one," growled Popa. "You ought to be in the transport section." "Wish I was. I'd dodge your tongue wagon," replied Fitz. "Get on with the job," growled Popa. We overcame the difficulty by cutting a half-moon in the cloth around Horrie's rudder. Similarly, with the other little difficulty, to the top of the neck piece, we sewed the unit color patch, braided the edges with tape, and made all complete except for the buttons by sewing 2 little gold corporal's stripes to the tunic over the right leg. We'd been wondering how we could obtain the buttons, but a brainwave solved it. I engaged Feather's attention by pointing out the excellent fit of the uniform, while Don quietly snipped the buttons off Feather's tunic, which was hanging up on the tent pole. Feathers always did keep his buttons clean and shining. Horry was quaintly pleased with his new uniform. Proudly he stepped out to do the rounds of the camp and show it to his many friends. They admired him so much that he swelled out until the suit nearly lost its buttons. He returned to us fairly treading on air, but immediately growled menacingly and began searching to locate an Arab, for an Arab voice was harshly resounding throughout the tent. Then he made a dash for the wireless, and I had to switch off the station. It was about this time I received a mouth organ from home and proceeded to enliven the rebels' company. Monotony. "Can you play Far, Far Away?" groaned Don. "I'll try," I replied hopefully. "Well, there's the direction," and he pointed out the tent to the desert. But Horry was appreciative. His was a musical soul, and he loved to sit back and howl accompaniment, as only a Wog Dog can. "You should train Horry to sit up and hold your hat in his mouth," suggested Fitz. "It will earn you many a feed after the war." "It's about all any of you will be good for," sighed Popa. "I can see you grinding a monkey organ in Pitt Street," grinned Fitz. "It's you will be holding the hat in that case," replied Popa. "I'll paint you a sign," volunteered the Gog to me. "Spare a coin for an old digger. You can hang it round your neck while Horrie collects the coins." But Horrie was faithful to me and my music. At this period of our training, leave was fairly plentiful, but on a percentage basis. This meant that seldom could more than 2 of the rebels go together. When they returned, 2 more would go. Horrie also went. At the mere mention of leave, he became excited. "Yes, Horrie, you can go if you know where your uniform is," and Horrie would run to the tent post and try to climb it in his eagerness to put on that uniform. Horrie was far and away the most traveled dog in Palestine. He had seen more of it than the majority of the troops. Its principal cities and many of the towns and villages were familiar to him, but now, when he strutted about in his fine new uniform, he became better known than ever. Troops that we seldom were in contact with recognized him, and civilians too. "That's the little wog dog," was a common exclamation as Horrie, at the head of a leave party, would march proudly along a street. Camps, soldiers' clubs, popular cafes, beaches, dance halls, wherever soldiers congregated, Horrie was a familiar sight. If the boys turned into any of the numerous wine and spirit cafes in any town, Horrie was there too. He'd sit up on the counter and drink his glass of milk with the best. No matter how many shouts there were, Horrie would always accept his glass. Never would he let it be said he couldn't take it. He would waddle out of the cafe, blown out like a barrage balloon. But he was always the soldier's dog. He would take no familiarity from anyone except an Australian soldier in uniform. The Jewish and Arab cafe owners often tried to pat him, but received in thanks a warning growl, as did civilians in the street. One day, Don and I escorted 2 Australian nursing sisters on a tour of Old Jaffa, and although we spent the entire day with them, Horrie most ungraciously would not allow them to pat him. He was a dyed-in-the-wool digger's dog, and he recognized the digger uniform only. It was when due for a trip to Jaffa that Popa advised me, "Be sure and visit Elijah's cave." Why? Because the Jews reckon that anyone unbalanced in mind becomes sane again if he visits the cave. "Thanks. Isn't it time you paid the cave a visit?" "I did," grinned Popa, "way back in 1918. "Doesn't seem to have done you much good," remarked Fitz. "That's because you can't distinguish the difference," replied Popa. "You're overdue for a visit. In fact, it's so noticeable that the OC has ordered me to take all the rebels there." I did not visit Elijah's cave, but the Jews also say that anyone suffering from nervous disorders becomes cured after a few days there. The cave is at the foot of Mount Carmel. The Arabs call Elijah the prophet Al-Hadar, which means the Green One. He was popular and will be forever green in the memory of the Arabs. A somewhat embarrassing incident occurred when I was booking in at the Hotel Haifa. The proprietor, who spoke imperfect English, inquired if I wanted a room with or without. This could mean various things. Perhaps it meant with or without a bathroom, or telephone, or anything. I thought he must have meant with or without the wog dog, so I answered with. Later, I'd comfortably snuggled down in my virtuous couch when the door softly opened. A vision glided in and paused with a hesitant smile at the menacing growl from Horrie. In the half-light from the passageway, her big, dark eyes smiled inquiringly at me. Noiselessly, the door closed, and she was there. For a long, startled moment, I did not realize that this was the width. After some wretchedly embarrassing explanations, in which I pictured myself torn to death by a sweet young thing scorned, I managed to get rid of her with a suitable present. To make security doubly sure, I phoned the proprietor and impressed upon him that I had changed my mind. I wanted the room without. The puzzled, silly ass again mistook me. I had just dozed into uneasy slumber when a growl from Horrie warned that trouble had come again. I opened startled eyes to find the room commandeered by a complete harem. You can only realize such a situation by experiencing it. Smiling beauties glided towards me, drifting all around the bed, giggling softly. Several of them became embarrassingly insistent. In an awful pickle, I tried to explain I preferred to sleep with my dog for company, but they burst into silvery laughter and politely insisted they must have misunderstood me. Understandably so, for there was no comparison between their charms and the angry rumbling of the wog dog. The more I stuttered, the more they chattered and giggled, trying to understand just what variety of girl I really did desire, and arguing around the bed while I huddled there in a perfect funk, hanging on to the indignant Horrie. Then they commenced giggling and chuckling and pointing at the outraged wog dog, until neither he nor I could stand it any longer. I simply cleared out. It was the quickest evacuation of my military career. At the next hotel, I most definitely impressed upon a sleepy proprietor. Without. I found that with or without is the custom even at the best hotels in Haifa, but you may be sure I never mentioned that evacuation to the rebels. I overstayed leave as usual, and to make up time decided to risk the Wog bus. This bus was always full of Arabs returning from Haifa, but an uncomfortable ride in it meant I would save a few hours. The bus was loaded with a choice assortment of Arab cutthroats. Horrie was hotly indignant at being forced to mix with such company, and expressed his sentiments in no uncertain manner. His growls and teeth showing were acknowledged by dark scowls at us both. Those Arabs would have loved to draw a knife very slowly across Horrie's throat, keeping a tight grip on the little furry. I maneuvered for a seat at the back of the bus, so that should trouble develop, I would only have one front to protect. To cop what could easily develop into a nasty situation, A digger very much the worse for wear staggered in just before we pulled out from Jaffa. Though Jaffa was then very much out of bounds for troops, it was easy to see the digger had been hitting the high spots. Giving scowl for scowl, he shouldered his way up through the bus and commandeered a seat in the middle. He hadn't noticed me away at the back, but obviously he didn't care if he was alone amongst all the Arabs in Palestine. The bus started off, and my anxiety increased as the digger commenced to abuse the wogs, who retaliated with Arab curses. I shouted warnings to him, being anxious to keep the peace until the bus reached the main road, where help might be handy in the event of trouble. But an Arab spat in the digger's eye. He promptly punched the wog, and the bus was a howling bedlam of struggling humanity, enlivened by the barking of the wog dog, and roars from a digger being kicked and clawed and trampled to death. I grabbed a fire extinguisher to swing it as a club, but it started to spray and filled the bus with fumes. I used it like a Tommy gun, and the wogs panicked under the fumes. In one mass they surged to the front of the bus, with Horrie at their heels. During this excitement, there was an awful swerve and a crunch as the mob upset the driver, and the bus thundered off the road. I went head over heels, but still sprayed all around me, nearly suffocating Horrie, with a demented Arab fell across me. Fortunately, the bus did not overturn, but came to a bumping stop, with gasping, nearly suffocated Arabs leaping off and making for the horizon. With a screech of brakes, several big Australian trucks had pulled up, and the men leapt down into the melee and grabbed the last of the nearly blinded Arabs. I yelled to the Aussies to lay off, for it really was all the digger's fault. Gasping for my own breath, I was still hazily wondering at the miraculous escape. We slung the digger into a truck and pushed off before the red caps should arrive. The digger was unconscious. He'd received enough blows on the head to have killed 3 men, but the luck of the drunk stuck to him. The boys and the truck dropped me near camp and took the digger to a first aid post, where I sincerely hoped he'd be forced to swallow the stiffest dose of salts ever administered.